Hello, Damien from Cloud Technology Experts. In this video, I'd like to discuss a Kubernetes service. I'll start off by explaining the concept of a Kubernetes service, and then I will go to CLI and show you how to create a Kubernetes service. There are two Kubernetes services that you will work with most of the time. One is called a Kubernetes deployment object, and the other one is called a Kubernetes service object. I already talked about the Kubernetes deployment in one of my previous videos, so in this video, I'll talk about a Kubernetes service. In a microservices architecture, for example, you will have so many pods created to host your application. However, these pods are ephemeral, they are not permanent, so they can get killed and replaced frequently. Whenever a pod gets killed and replaced, the name changes. So if you have an application which references your pod by its name, when the pod gets killed and replaced with a new one, your application will no longer have the name of the new pod. This can create problems for your application. A better solution is to create a service which points to your pod at the back end. Then, instead of referencing the pods directly, you reference the pods through the service object. That is helpful because the service object never changes, even though the pods gets killed and replaced frequently. So services helps you to act as a front end to your back end pods so that you have a constant way of addressing your pods. There are four main types of service objects in Kubernetes. The first one is called the cluster IP. Cluster IP. Two is called the node port. Three is called the load balancer. And four is called the external name. Cluster IP, this is the default. That is, if you create a service and you don't specify a type to be either a node port or a load balancer or an external name, then default is cluster IP. With a cluster IP, the service is given a local IP address. A local IP address within your cluster. And this IP is not reachable from outside of your cluster. So this is just for internal access from within your cluster. If you want to access your service from outside of your cluster, you have the option to use either the node port or the load balancer. If you use the node port, then you'll be given an IP address of the node where your pod or your service is running. And then it will be given a port, usually in a certain range between 30,000 to 767,000. Okay, so an IP of your node plus a port within this range. That enables you to access your service from outside of your cluster. Notice also that whenever you create a node port, a cluster IP will be created at the background. Now, load balancer. This appeals mainly to cloud providers. Cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, they will have a library or an API that makes it possible for you to connect your service to a load balancer. In that way, you can reach your services from outside of the cloud, from anywhere in the world. It is accessible from the internet. Now, the fourth type of external name is kind of special. It is different from the first three we just discussed so far. External name is used to point a service to an outside application, an application which resides outside of your Kubernetes cluster. So a typical example is when you design an application and you have an internal database. You have an internal database which you are using, but in the process of migration, you do not necessarily want to use the internal database which you're using for testing. In that way, you have the option to point your Kubernetes application to a database which is residing outside of your cluster. For example, you can use something like AWS RDS service. So in this case, once you create a service of type external name, you can give a definition to say that your application should directly access the AWS RDS service, which is outside of your cluster. So these are the four main types of services types that you have in Kubernetes. Here, I want to show you how to create a service from your CLI. I have two files. I have a deployment file and I have a service file. Deployment and service always goes together. Each time you create your deployment object, you want to create a service to map to the pods which are created inside your deployment. So in this example here, we're going to create 4 pods. Okay, as you can see on this line here. And then we'll create a service. Once we create a service, we want to map the service to the 4 pods which are created inside this deployment object. It's always a best practice to first create your service objects before you create your deployment objects. Now let's look at these 2 files. The most important thing I want to show you here is a label. We have a label here called app nginx. So in Kubernetes, you can identify a group of pods with a label so that later on you can make a selection based on those. So when we come to the service file, we are making a selection based on those based on the label that we gave to it as app nginx. In other words, when we create the service, we want it to get mapped onto all the pods that has a label called app nginx. So let me show you how to do that. You can do okay, so the service is created. If you do kubectl get service, we have the nginx is here created. Now let's create a deployment. Okay, so now the deployment has been created. So if we do kubectl get pods, we have all the pods are running. If we do kubectl get deploy, we have the deployment working. So let's describe the service and see all the pods which are mapped. kubectl describe service nginx. So here we've described the file. You can see that we have 4 pods which are mapped to this service. In other words, each time you try to contact this service, if you do curl 10.0.0.237 on port 80, you can do that. If there's a web service running, it will come up on that port. At the same time, it's the same as doing coming to any of the ports 172.17.0.4 port 80. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm trying to access the service or the application which is running inside this pod. However, nothing is coming up because the application is probably not ready at this point. Alright, so I've shown you here how to create your Kubernetes service. I also showed you how to create your Kubernetes deployment objects, and we are able to map the pods to the service object using labels and selector. On the pod description inside the deployment object, we give it a label of app Nginx. Then inside the service file, we give it a selector called app Nginx. And then we're able to map all the ports that were created in the deployment object to the service object. All right. So basically, I've shown you how you use a service object in Kubernetes. I hope you like this video. If you do, please remember to subscribe to our channel and also to come back for more videos like this one. Again, it's Damien from Cloud Technology Experts, and thank you for watching.